What is up guys, how are we all doing? In today's video I'm going to be teaching you about the camera basics on the camera for video, which would be shutter speed, ISO, aperture, you name it. Okay, so today we're going to be learning about the camera basics for video mainly. I'm also going to be getting into some photography, but mostly it's going to be video orientated. Hi, I'm from the future. I'm just quickly going to correct myself. It's mostly going to be about both photography and video. Good, let's get back. It's important to understand that all the settings on a camera, which would be shutter speed, aperture and ISO, are all connected, and it doesn't necessarily benefit you to just know each individual one. So it's important to understand that every single setting are connected, and that's why it's also a little bit difficult to explain it, because they depend on each other. So, you know, stick around. But first we're gonna go into shutter speed. Shutter speed essentially is how long the camera opens to let light in when taking a picture or filming. That essentially means that, for example, usually a shutter speed would be around from 30 seconds to 1/4000th of a second. At 30 seconds, if you've ever taken a photo at 30 seconds handheld, you'd realize that the photo is probably gonna look a little bit weird, and that's because it lets light in for 30 seconds, which means first of all, it's probably gonna turn out white because it's overexposed, because tons of light gets let in during those 30 seconds. Second of all, it's gonna look all weird because when it actually lets in light for 30 seconds, you could say that it takes a picture for 30 seconds. So everything that's happening in front of the frame for these 30 seconds are gonna be part of the picture, which is why usually when you take a 30-second exposure, it would be in front of something that would look good over the duration of 30 seconds. So if you've ever seen some of those cool low light city photos with cars driving by and you have those light rays, I'll probably show you some examples. It looks extremely cool. It's a very cool effect, and it's actually as simple as just letting your shutter be open for a longer period of time. Another example would be in front of some sort of water where you see the water looks all weird and stuff. It's actually pretty simple. It's because you let the shutter open, and all the information during those 30 or 15 or 10 seconds, however long it is, will be captured into the frame. One of the things that you need to remember when doing long exposures and stuff like that is that the longer the shutter opens, the more light is gonna go in, and therefore it's pretty difficult to do long exposures in daylight because so much light gets in and it just becomes overexposed. So that's definitely something that you need to keep in mind. ND filters is a solution for that, but that's a whole nother video. Just for now, when you expose something for long, tons of light gets in and it usually ends up overexposed. But that is why usually long exposures are taken during nighttime, because obviously when it's nighttime, it's dark outside and not as much light comes into the camera. So yeah. On the other end of the shutter speed, we have the quick exposure. Let's just say that you have your camera, you put the shutter speed all the way down to 1/4000th part of a second, which is lightning quick. Speaking of lightning quick, obviously when you do that, the sensor only opens for so long, which would be obviously 1/4000th of a second, which is a very short time to let in light. There's some benefits and there are some bad things about that. The benefits of that is that you can capture a moment very quick. Let's just say that you have some water going down, it's a fountain or a waterfall or something similar. Basically what you do is that, as we saw on the long exposure, the water is going to look all weird, and that's because it's over the duration of a longer period. But when it's just a tiny little moment the shutter opens, the picture is going to be looking totally different, because it actually captures the moment much quicker than your eye sees. So it actually is going to capture every single drop from that water, and it's going to look totally different. I'm probably going to show you some examples once again, and hopefully you understand what I'm saying. One of the bad sides of doing a quick exposure like that is that it lets in pretty much no light at all, which means that you actually have to get light another way, which obviously connects to the other parts of this video, which would be aperture and ISO. And the same goes for the long exposure, when you have to get less light in from the other parts, which is ISO and aperture. So now we're gonna move on to aperture. I'm gonna explain that, and then I'm gonna explain the connection that it has with the shutter speed. The aperture is not in the camera, it's in the lens. It's a little bit similar with the shutter speed in terms of letting in light and not letting in light, but it has a totally different function. I have a very good lens to show that on, which is this 50mm right here. Essentially what this does is that there are some numbers. You've probably seen them before. They are called f-stops. Essentially, the higher the number, the less light, and the lower the number, the more light gets in. So on this particular lens, it's a 50mm lens. It goes from f16 to f1.4. So at f16, you can see that it has a tiny little bit of an opening in there. And as we move it along to f11, f8, 5.6, f4, f2.8, f2 and f1.4. You can see that it opens more and more each time. And what that does is that the more it is open, the more light gets in. It's actually very simple stuff, but what does this actually do, letting in more light or less light? In terms of just aperture, at f16, when you let in just a tiny little bit of light, everything in the frame is pretty much going to be in focus. But as you let more light in through the lens, the more shallow the picture is going to be, which basically means that the lower the number, the more light gets in. The more light gets in, the more shallow the picture is going to be. And what does shallow means? It means blurry backgrounds or bokeh, however you want to say that. So if you're at f1.4, the lens opens up completely. You're gonna let in a lot more light, and when you do that, you're gonna get those beautiful blurry backgrounds that we all love to see. So that's basically just the whole thing with aperture, but there's obviously a lot more to it because it connects with the other settings. The way that it connects with the shutter speed is that, for example, you're doing a 30-second exposure, you're gonna let in a lot of light during a 30-second exposure. So you can actually do something with your lens, which would be, in this case, turn it all the way down to f16 to let in as little of light as possible. Obviously, f16 is not really that all impressive, so if you're gonna do a 30-second exposure, it's not really gonna do the trick, but it could help you if you're doing a 2-second exposure or 1-second exposure or something like that. So that's how that works. When you're doing a quick shutter, however, 1/4000th of a second or something similar, it would be a good idea to turn this lens all the way over to 1.4 to let in more light, because doing the quick shutter, you don't let in any light at all. So you compensate with the aperture to let in more light. I hope you understand it. Anyways, another thing with aperture is that it actually improves your low light performance. And this is where we're gonna get into the third setting, which is ISO. ISO is essentially just the camera brightening up the footage. It has nothing to do with opening anything, closing anything. It's just like going into post and upping the exposure. When you do that, however, the noise is gonna be a problem because the higher you put up that ISO, the more noisy the image is gonna get, because the ISO is just a digital way of pulling up the exposure. So because of that, you're gonna lose details and the noise is gonna start to get annoying. Obviously this varies from camera to camera, but some cameras can go up to like 6400 ISO and it would be totally fine, and some cameras cannot go above 600, 800 ISO and it just becomes totally unusable at that point. And that is why obviously some of the cameras, full frame cameras, are a lot more expensive than the lower end cameras, because it can do things like that, put up the ISO. So ISO in general is actually very simple. It's a digital way of improving that exposure, making the footage more bright. And you do this when you can't actually get the proper exposure with the lens, the aperture and the shutter speed. Let's say that you have 1/4000th of a second. Once again, I don't know why you keep doing this, but you have. And you only have a lens that goes down to f4, which means that it doesn't let as much light in as a 1.4, for example. And it's actually way too dark, because even though you compensated with the lens to your shutter, it's still too dark, which means that you have to up your ISO to get a proper exposure. And that's where the more expensive camera comes into play, because in some cases you can up that ISO to a lot and it would still be a perfectly fine picture or video. And in most cases with the lower ends, it's when you up that ISO, it's gonna look bad. So that is essentially how ISO works. It's just a digital way of brightening up that footage. And as I previously mentioned with the Aperture, that it actually also improves your low light. And as I just mentioned with the quick exposure, it's actually a little bit of the same. The more light you can let in through the lens, the less you're gonna have to up that ISO, which means that you're gonna get less noisy footage because you can get more light through the lens instead of upping the ISO. Because as I said, when you up that ISO, it's gonna get noisy, it's gonna be unusable. So that's why you need to have fast lenses that can let in a lot of light to get a better low light performance. And I wanna go back to the shutter speed now, once again, just to confuse you all. It's great. I just mentioned like the basics of the shutter speed. When it comes to video, shutter speed is a little bit different because you actually wanna keep the shutter speed at the same at all times, pretty much. Basically, the rule is that with shutter speed, when you're recording film, is that you always keep it double of your frame rate. And I would always advise you, if you're filming movies, films, to record in 24 frames per second. The closest thing to 24 frames per second on the shutter is 1/50th of a second, because you can't go to 1/48th of a second. 1/50th is the closest. And there's actually a very, very simple reason for this. It's all about the motion blur. Because when taking pictures, if you have it, let's just say you have it on a tripod, with a quick exposure, as I mentioned, you can capture the moment very quick. There's not gonna be any motion blur whatsoever. If you lower that shutter speed to 1 second and something goes by, motion blur comes. Just like with the car lights that I explained earlier, that is actually just motion blur of the car going by. When recording film, you need to get the right natural looking motion blur. There is 24 frames per second when you shoot 24 frames per second. Pretty obvious. But let's just think of it like this. Every single frame per second is a picture. And you need to get the motion blur right on every single picture. So when shooting at 1/50th, which is the double of your frame rate, you get that perfectly natural looking motion blur. So if you're recording at 30 frames per second, it would be 1/60th of a second. If you're recording at 60 frames per second, it would be 120th of a second, because that is the way to get that natural looking motion blur. That is the golden rule. Make sure you have your shutter at the double your frame rate, or at least as close as possible. Okay, I think I'm through it all now. I'm very sorry if it is all complicated and it's difficult to understand, but it all kind of makes sense if you just go for it. Because you probably, if you're watching this for the first time, this is the first time you're hearing about these settings and how they work, it's probably gonna be a little bit overwhelming because they all connect and you gotta know what does what and how does that affect that and stuff like that. I'd say to begin with, just try and each individual and see, okay, what does this do? What does the shutter do? Okay, good. What does the aperture do? Okay, creates blurry backgrounds and it lets in a lot of light when it does that and stuff like that. And the ISO is just a digital way of pulling up that exposure, but you get noise with it, so you actually want to avoid doing that. Just go through it, maybe watch this video a couple times more. Okay, I hope you guys learned something from this video. I hope it wasn't too complicated. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you'll leave a like and subscribe to the channel. I'm gonna be making a bunch of content in the future, in the near future that is. So stick around, I'm gonna be uploading very, very consistently, or at least that's my goal. So stick around, subscribe, and I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.